Get off my stage, boy. Your kind belongs cleaning toilets, not touching a piano.
Harrison Whitaker spat the words into a live mic at the Lucas Theater. 1,600 people heard it. Nobody moved. Brandon Fletcher, 16, stood frozen in his thrift store jacket. His hands were shaking, but his feet stayed planted on that stage. Brandon didn't walk away. He looked the judge dead in the eye and said,
My mom is dying, sir. This song is for her. You can hate me after.
Whitaker laughed.
Save it. Much like you always have one. No daddy, no money. Sit down and play Charity Case. Let's get this over with.
Brandon sat down at the piano. What that white judge didn't know, what nobody in that theater knew, was exactly who this black boy really was to him. 3 weeks before that stage, before the stage lights and the cameras and the cruelty, Brandon Fletcher was mopping the floor of a 24-hour diner on West Broad Street in Savannah, Georgia. It was 4:40 in the morning. The linoleum smelled like bleach and cold grease. Brandon worked the mop in slow, even strokes, the way his mother had taught him when he was 7 years old and too small to reach the bucket handle. "Do it right the first time," she used to say, "and you won't have to do it twice." She said that about everything. Mopping floors, folding laundry, playing scales. At 5, he clocked out, walked 6 blocks through the gray half-light, and climbed the outside stairs to the 2-bedroom rental above the Lucky Star laundromat. The stairs creaked in 3 places. He knew which ones, and he stepped around them. Because his mother was still sleeping, and she needed every minute of sleep her body would give her. Denise Fletcher was 38 years old. She had been a mezzo-soprano at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music once. She had a recording, somewhere, of her singing Schubert at a graduation recital, and when Brandon was small, she used to play it for him on an old cassette deck, and he would fall asleep with his cheek against the speaker. That was a long time ago. Now she weighed 94 pounds. She had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The insurance company had denied the experimental treatment that might have given her another 2 years. The treatment cost $87,000, and the Fletchers had, on their best month, about $200 left after rent. Brandon set his backpack down on the kitchen table and pulled out what he had been working on all shift, between orders, folded inside a grease-stained order pad. It was a page of sheet music, handwritten. The title at the top read, Mama's Lullaby in D minor. He had started writing that lullaby when he was 9 years old. His mother had finished the first 4 bars of it for him and wept when he played them back to her on the Casio keyboard a neighbor had given him. She had never told him who wrote those first 4 bars. She had only said, once, "It sounded like someone I used to know." He did not push her on it. Brandon Fletcher had learned early what questions his mother would not answer. There were 2 things in that apartment that Brandon had noticed his whole life and never asked about. The first was a small cedar box his mother kept under her bed. He had seen it only twice when she thought he was asleep. It had a little brass latch and a key she wore on a chain around her neck, under her clothes. The second was that whenever Brandon played the lullaby, his mother would sit very still, and after a while she would get up and leave the room. He learned not to follow her. On the Tuesday before the competition, Brandon walked past the window of the diner on his way home and saw a flyer taped to the glass. Southern Star's National Music Competition, $100,000 grand prize, full scholarship to the Juilliard School. Auditions June 15th, Lucas Theater, Savannah. He stood there for a long time. His breath fogged the glass. That evening, he walked 4 miles to the Mount Carmel Baptist Church on Cuyler Street, where Eleanor Brown, the 70-year-old church organist who had been teaching him piano for free since he was 5 years old, was locking up. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "I'm going to enter." Eleanor Brown looked at him over her reading glasses for a long moment. She was a small, sturdy woman with iron gray hair and hands that had been playing hymns since the Eisenhower administration. She had discovered Brandon's perfect pitch the first day Denise had brought him to her Sunday school class. "Brandon, baby," she said slowly. "That competition. The head judge is a man named Harrison Whitaker." "I know who he is." "No," Eleanor shook her head. "You don't. And I pray to Jesus you never have to." She did not finish the sentence. She turned and locked the sanctuary door, and they walked out into the savannah dusk together without speaking. The next morning, Brandon filled out the entry form in pencil. The fee was $85. He wrote the check and watched the balance in his checkbook drop to $91. June 15th arrived hot and bright and humid, the way only Savannah can be in June. Brandon stepped off the city bus at 10 minutes to 10 in the morning, wearing the only suit he owned, a black church suit his mother had bought him 2 years ago at a Goodwill on Abercorn Street, the sleeves already an inch too short. He carried his sheet music in a brown paper grocery bag because he didn't own a folder. The lobby of the Lucas Theater was full. 200 contestants, stage parents in tailored blazers, a camera crew from a regional network, boys in crisp tuxedos carrying leather cases embossed with their initials, girls in recital dresses that cost more than Brandon's rent. Brandon found a bench near the wall and sat down. He opened his grocery bag, spread his sheet music across his lap, and began to run through the Chopin in his head. His right hand moved silently against his thigh. His left hand followed. His eyes closed. He did not see Harrison Whitaker walk past with his entourage until the entourage stopped. "Well," Whitaker's voice was loud, amused, pitched to Carrie. "Would you look at this?" Brandon opened his eyes. The head judge was standing 3 feet away, flanked by 2 assistants and a woman with a clipboard. A stage mother nearby turned to watch. The camera crew swung around. Whitaker looked Brandon up and down. The suit, the paper bag, the worn shoes. "The service entrance," Whitaker said, "is around the back, son. They'll tell you where to deliver whatever you're carrying." The stage mother laughed. A short, sharp sound. Brandon stood up slowly. He was a full head shorter than Whitaker, and skinnier by 40 pounds, and he was 16 years old. He did not raise his voice. "I'm here to compete, sir." For a half second, Whitaker's smile slipped, just a flicker. Something in his face, surprise maybe, or something deeper than surprise, moved and then was buried again under the smirk. "Oh," he said. "Well, good luck with that." He walked off. The entourage followed. Brandon sat back down. His hands were shaking in his lap, but he pressed them flat against the sheet music and kept them still. From across the lobby, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard had been watching the entire exchange. She had stopped walking. She was staring at Brandon the way a person stares at a face they have seen somewhere before. Her name was Rebecca Williams. She was the production assistant, and under her arm she carried a sealed manila envelope that she never, under any circumstances, let out of her sight. A moment later she turned and walked quickly toward the backstage corridor, pulling out her phone as she went. There was a payphone at the back of the Lucas Theater lobby, bolted to the wall next to a water fountain that didn't work. Brandon hadn't seen a working payphone in 3 years. His cell had been cut off 2 weeks ago when Denise's last hospital bill came in, and he had chosen between the phone and the electric. He fished 2 quarters out of his pocket and dialed home. His mother picked up on the 4th ring. Her voice was thin and far away, the way it always sounded in the mornings now, before the pain medication kicked in. "Baby, you there yet?" "I'm here, Mama." "They call your number?" "Not yet. I'm number 82. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing, slow, careful, the way she breathed now because deeper breaths hurt her. "Brandon?" Her voice dropped. "Something wrong?" He almost told her. He almost told her about Whitaker and the service entrance and the laughing stage mother and the way the whole lobby had watched him like he was a stain on the carpet. He didn't. "No, Mama, I'm all right." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She coughed. He winced at the sound. "Baby," she said, "you don't owe these people nothing. You hear me? You come home if you need to come home. We'll figure something out. We always do." Brandon closed his eyes. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the payphone. "Mama," he said, "if I play the way you taught me to play, they ain't gonna be able to lie about it, even if they try." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft. "You go on, baby. You go on and play." He hung up. He stood there for a moment with his hand still on the receiver. Then he turned and looked at his own reflection in the glass of the lobby window. A thin black boy in a borrowed black suit, 16 years old, scared to death. He whispered so quietly that only his reflection could hear him. "He chose a piano. I'll choose you." He didn't know yet why those words would matter. He didn't know yet that he was talking about a man he had never met. He walked toward the stage door. Rebecca Williams was standing there with a bottle of water. She handed it to him without a word. As he took it, she said, very quietly, "Whatever happens out there, play like she's listening. She deserves to hear it." Brandon didn't understand what she meant. He would. In time, he would. They called his number at 11:40. Brandon walked onto the stage of the Lucas Theater the way a man walks onto a bridge he is not sure will hold him. The house lights were down. The stage lights were up. He could not see the audience, but he could feel them. 1,600 seats, half of them filled with contestants and families and industry scouts. Somewhere out there, in the third row, was his mother. Eleanor Brown had driven her. Denise had insisted on coming, oxygen tank and all. She had told Eleanor, on the way over, "If my baby is going to play on a stage like that, I am going to be in that room." Brandon walked to the piano. A 9-foot Steinway concert grand, the most expensive instrument he had ever touched. He sat down. He adjusted the bench. He cracked the knuckles of his right hand once, the way Eleanor had taught him to do before a service. At the judges' table, Harrison Whitaker did not look up. He was scrolling through something on his phone. To his left, the co-judge, Margaret Anderson, a retired opera mezzo who had sung at La Scala 3 times in the 1980s, was watching Brandon with careful, unreadable eyes. To Whitaker's right sat a younger judge, a conservatory dean known to owe Harrison Whitaker several very large favors. The required piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Brandon leaned forward into the microphone clipped to the piano. "With respect to the panel," he said, "I'll play the required piece, but I'd like to dedicate it to my mother. She's in the third row. She taught me everything I know about music." Whitaker didn't look up. He made a small, circular, get-on-with-it gesture with one finger. Margaret Anderson sat forward in her chair. Brandon put his hands on the keys. He played the first 8 bars the way Chopin wrote them. Clean. Elegant. Whitaker's thumb kept scrolling, and then in the 9th bar, Brandon's left hand did something that was not on the page. It was a single grace note, a small bending dip in the bass line, like a voice clearing its throat before it begins to speak. Margaret Anderson caught it. Her head tilted 1/4 of an inch. By the 12th bar, his left hand was running a second melody underneath the Chopin, a slow, aching thing in D minor. Not a decoration, a conversation. The 2 melodies folded into each other as if they had been waiting 170 years to meet. A stagehand in the wings stopped moving. A contestant in the green room monitor, a boy in a tuxedo who had already been politely told he was very good, began, without knowing why, to cry. In the third row, Denise Fletcher closed her eyes. Tears rolled down the hollows of her cheeks, and she was not wiping them away because she needed both hands on the armrests to hold herself upright. At the judge's table, Harrison Whitaker's thumb stopped scrolling. He did not look up yet. He was listening. His head was tilted the way a dog's head tilts when it hears a frequency only it can hear. The second melody, the one Brandon was weaving into the Chopin, was the opening 4 bars of Mama's Lullaby in D minor. The melody his mother had told him years ago sounded like someone I used to know. At 2 minutes and 14 seconds into his performance, Harrison Whitaker finally looked up, and the color drained from his face. He was a man famous for composure, famous for his dead-eyed stare at trembling contestants. People in the industry said he had not shown an unguarded emotion on camera in 20 years. But right then, in front of a theater full of witnesses, his mouth fell open a half-inch, and his eyes went wide and wet and lost, as if he had just walked into a ghost. His pen fell out of his hand. It rolled across the table and landed in Margaret Anderson's lap. She did not pick it up. She was too busy watching him. Brandon could not see any of this. Brandon's eyes were closed. Brandon was back in the apartment above the laundromat, 9 years old, playing a lullaby for his mother on a Casio keyboard. He brought the Chopin home on the final chord. He held it. He let it ring through the theater until the last vibration died out of the wood. There was silence for a full 3 seconds. Then one pair of hands began to clap. Margaret Anderson had stood up. The 74-year-old former diva of La Scala was on her feet at the judges' table of a regional youth competition, clapping. A beat later, the stagehand in the wings. Then the boy in the tuxedo. Then, impossibly, the other contestants in the audience, the ones who were supposed to be his competition, stood and began to applaud. Harrison Whitaker did not applaud. He had gone very still, hands flat on the table, staring at Brandon Fletcher the way a man stares at the edge of a cliff he did not know he was standing on. Margaret Anderson leaned across the table and spoke into Whitaker's ear. She did not know her microphone was still hot. Everyone in the first 12 rows heard her. "Harrison," she said, "that boy is going to the finals, or I am walking out of this building and telling every reporter in that parking lot exactly why." There was a long pause. Whitaker's jaw moved once. "Fine." He advances. Brandon stood up. He bowed once to the judges, once to the audience. He walked off stage. In the 3rd row, his mother was sobbing into Eleanor Brown's shoulder. Backstage, Rebecca Williams was pressed against the wall near the stage door, one hand over her mouth, the other holding her phone to her ear. "You need to get down here. Right now," she said, in a voice that was shaking. "It's happening. He played the lullaby." On the other end of the line, a voice Brandon would not hear for another 2 weeks said one word. "How?" "Because his mother taught it to him," Rebecca said, "and Harrison just heard his own handwriting played back to him on that piano." She hung up. Brandon walked past her without seeing her. He walked out the stage door and sat down on the concrete step in the alley, and for the first time since he was 9 years old, he let himself cry. He didn't know why he was crying. He only knew that something had just happened out there that he would never be able to undo. He was right. The clip of Brandon's audition hit the internet before he got home that night. Someone in the Lucas Theater, nobody ever figured out who, had filmed the last 90 seconds on a phone from the balcony. The video was grainy. The sound was compressed. It didn't matter. By Sunday morning, the clip had 4 million views. By Monday morning, it had 11. The comment section filled up with musicians, pianists, conservatory professors, and one Grammy-winning composer from Nashville who wrote simply, "Whoever this child is, protect him." Brandon did not see any of it. Brandon did not have a phone. He learned about it on Tuesday, when Eleanor Brown called the apartment landline and said, "Baby, you better sit down." The semifinals were scheduled for the following Saturday. Brandon spent every morning that week at Mount Carmel Baptist, practicing on the church Steinway until Eleanor made him stop and eat. Every evening he worked his shift at the diner. Every night he sat on the edge of his mother's bed and played her the pieces he was going to perform, softly, on the Casio, so she could sleep to them. On the morning of the semifinals, Brandon arrived at the Lucas Theater an hour early. He wanted to warm up on the practice piano they had promised him in the contestant letter. He was told, politely, by a stagehand he had never seen before, that the practice piano was unavailable. Scheduling conflict. He nodded and sat down to wait. When they called his number, he walked out onto the stage and sat down at the Steinway, and the moment his hands touched the keys, he knew something was wrong. Middle C sharp was flat. Not slightly flat, noticeably flat. 15 cents flat. The kind of flat a trained ear catches inside of 2 bars, and an untrained ear feels as a vague wrongness it cannot name. He looked at the judges' table. Harrison Whitaker was watching him with a small, tight smile. Brandon understood, in that moment, exactly what had been done, and exactly who had done it. He had 2 choices. He could stop playing and ask for a tuned instrument, in which case the panel would note his unprofessional interruption on the score sheet and quietly knock half a point off for temperament. Or he could play the piano he had been given. He played the piano he had been given, and here is what he did. It is the thing that made Margaret Anderson, watching from the judges' table, whisper the word impossible under her breath. He rewrote the piece on the fly. He was playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C sharp minor, a piece that sits by its nature all over the offending note. Brandon took every passage that would have exposed the flat C sharp and transposed it up an octave, where the flaw was less audible. He bent the phrasing around the sour note the way a river bends around a rock. Where the score called for him to land on C sharp as a resolution, he instead resolved a half step away and held the dissonance for a beat longer than Rachmaninoff wrote, so that the sourness became intentional. A moment of held ache that broke the heart of every trained musician in the room. He did not just survive the sabotage. He turned it into an interpretation. When he finished, Margaret Anderson was again on her feet. The scores came in an hour later. Margaret Anderson, 9.8. Third judge, 6.4. Harrison Whitaker, 6.2. Average, 7.46. He advanced. Barely. Meanwhile, a 17-year-old named Colton Davis, son of one of the competition's platinum-tier donors, a technically competent pianist with all the emotional depth of a dial tone, performed a clean, unremarkable Liszt etude on a perfectly tuned piano and received a 9.6 from Whitaker. Backstage, Rebecca Williams watched the scores post on the production monitor. She watched for a long moment without moving. Then she pulled out her phone, opened the voice memo app, and began walking quietly toward the judge's green room. That same night, Brandon came home to find his mother sitting up in bed. The cedar box he had seen only twice in his life was open on her lap. The little brass key was in her hand. "Baby," Denise said. Her voice was very steady. "Sit down. There's something I should have told you a long time ago." Brandon sat down. She did not speak for a long moment. Her hands were shaking. Then she said, "The man who wrote the first 4 bars of your lullaby, the man I told you sounded like someone I used to know? Baby, he didn't just sound like someone. He was someone." Brandon went very still. "And he was at that theater today," Denise said, "watching you play." Denise reached into the cedar box with trembling hands and pulled out a single photograph. She held it for a moment against her chest, the way a woman holds a thing she has carried alone for too long. Then she laid it on the quilt between them. Brandon picked it up. The photograph was 16 years old. The colors had faded. It showed a young woman, unmistakably his mother, but 22 years old, radiant, 7 months pregnant, one hand resting on her rounded belly. She was standing next to a grand piano. Beside her, with his arm around her waist, was a handsome black man in his late 20s, tall, lean, same cheekbones as Brandon, same long fingers. "That's my father," Brandon said. Not a question, a statement. Denise nodded. "Mama." Brandon's voice was very quiet. "You told me he left before I was born." "He did." "Who is he?" Denise reached into the box again. This time she pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The Savannah Morning News, dated 3 weeks after Brandon's birth. The headline read, "Rising composer signs with major label. Sources say Whitaker poised for breakout." The photograph accompanying the article showed the same man, 16 years younger, smiling at the camera, holding a contract. The name under the photograph read, Harrison Whitaker. Brandon did not move. He did not speak. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the face of the young man in the clipping, and then at the face in the photograph, and his hands began to shake the way his mother's hands had been shaking. And neither of them said anything for a long time. "He signed a paternity waiver," Denise said finally. "The label told him a mixed-race family would, what did they call it? Complicate his brand. He took the money. He left." "He's light-skinned in this photo, Mama." "He is black, baby. He is your father. He has spent 15 years rebuilding himself as a white man in every photograph he allows to be taken. And he has the money and the lawyers to make people pretend not to notice. That is who he is now." Brandon set the clipping down very carefully on the quilt. "Does he know about me?" "No." "And the lullaby, the first 4 bars?" Denise closed her eyes. "He wrote them," she said, "the night before he left. He said it was for our baby." Brandon sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "Mama, I'm not going to tell him." Denise opened her eyes. "I'm just going to play." On Thursday morning, 2 days before the final, a tabloid website called The Savannah Insider published a story with the headline, "Viral Piano Prodigy Accused of Plagiarism. Audition Melody Traced to 1990s Japanese Film Score." The article quoted an anonymous industry source. It claimed that Brandon Fletcher's original composition, the D minor melody he had woven into the Chopin, was lifted, note for note, from an obscure anime soundtrack released in 1998. A forensic musicologist, also anonymous, was quoted saying the similarity was statistically impossible to be coincidence. There was no anime soundtrack. There was no forensic musicologist. The entire article had been written, paid for, and placed by a public relations firm on retainer to Harrison Whitaker. It took investigative reporter Gregory Moore at the Savannah Morning News exactly 4 hours to trace the payment, but by lunchtime, the story had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By 2 p.m., the Southern Stars competition's corporate parent, a media holding company run by a CEO named Jonathan Taylor, had called an emergency meeting. Brandon was summoned to the Lucas Theater at 3 o'clock. He walked into the conference room in the same black church suit. Jonathan Taylor sat at the head of the table. Harrison Whitaker sat at the other end, arms folded, a small, satisfied smile on his face. Margaret Anderson was there. So was a lawyer for the competition. So were 2 executives whose names Brandon did not catch. "Mr. Fletcher," Jonathan Taylor said, "you have 24 hours to provide documentary proof that the melody you performed in your audition is your own original work. If you cannot, you will be disqualified." Harrison Whitaker uncrossed and recrossed his legs. "We have standards," he said, "even for charity cases." Brandon looked at him across the length of the table. He did not say anything. Margaret Anderson did. "Harrison," she said, "shut your mouth." Brandon walked out of that room and into the hallway, and Rebecca Williams was waiting for him. Denise was waiting too. Eleanor Brown had brought her in the wheelchair. Rebecca was shaking.
"I need to show you something," Rebecca said. "Both of you. Right now."
She pulled the manila envelope out from under her arm, the envelope she had carried for weeks. She handed it to Denise. Denise looked at it. She did not open it.
"Not now,"
Denise said quietly.
"Not until after my boy plays."
Brandon nodded. "I don't need his name," he said. "I need the truth about the music. That's different." Eleanor Brown was the one who solved it. She drove Brandon to the basement of Mount Carmel Baptist that same night. In a cardboard box labeled Children's Program Archive, under a stack of cracked VHS tapes, she found a single audio cassette. The label, in Eleanor's own handwriting, read, "Brandon Fletcher, age 4, first recording." She had recorded him on Easter Sunday in 2012. He had climbed onto the bench of the sanctuary piano after service, and he had picked out, by ear, the first 4 bars of the melody his mother hummed to him at night. Eleanor, dumbstruck, had hit record on the little cassette deck she used for choir rehearsals. The tape was date-stamped. The recording predated the fake original source by 14 years. Gregory Moore published the story at 9 a.m. Friday. He included an audio file of the 2012 cassette, a forensic audio analysis confirming the date stamp, and the wire transfer records tying the tabloid article back to Harrison Whitaker's publicist. The plagiarism smear collapsed inside of 2 hours. 3 national outlets retracted. The tabloid site took the article down. Whitaker's publicist was fired by noon. Harrison Whitaker himself issued no apology. When a reporter caught him in the parking lot of the Lucas Theater and asked him to comment, he said flatly, "Exceptional circumstances don't erase the need for standards," and got into his car. That was the moment Eleanor Brown decided to tell Brandon what she had been carrying for 20 years. She sat him down in the sanctuary that Friday afternoon. She told him that in the early 2000s, Harrison Whitaker had a quiet reputation in the black music community of 3 southern cities, a reputation for taking up with young black sopranos, making them promises, and disappearing.
"Your mother wasn't the first, baby," Eleanor said. "I taught one of the others, a girl named Charlene. She never got over it."
Brandon was very quiet. "Miss Eleanor," he said finally, "how long have you known?" Eleanor Brown looked at her hands. "Since the day your mama walked into my Sunday school class carrying a 2-year-old with his father's eyes," she said. "I have been waiting 20 years for the Lord to send me the right moment. I think the Lord just sent it." By Friday night, the story had broken wide open. Gregory Moore's second article ran above the fold in the Saturday edition of the Savannah Morning News. The headline read, "Whitaker publicist fired after fabricated plagiarism smear against black teen contestant." The article included the 2012 cassette recording, the forensic audio analysis, and a quote from Margaret Anderson that Margaret had given Moore over the phone at 10 p.m. the night before. The quote read, "Harrison Whitaker has blocked more black talent from this competition in 15 years than any other judge in its history. I have the records. I kept them. I'll hand them over the moment somebody with a badge asks me to." The internet detonated. By Saturday morning, the hashtag Justice for Brandon was the top trending tag on every major platform in the United States. By Saturday afternoon, it had been joined by hashtag Fire Whitaker and, more quietly, more devastatingly, hashtag Who Else Did He Do? As previous contestants, one after another, began stepping forward. 6 of them came forward by Sunday evening. 6 young musicians, 4 black, 2 Latino, who had been eliminated from the Southern Stars competition in the previous 15 years, each of them with a story, each of them with an audition tape, each of them with a memory of a dismissive remark from the head judge that they had swallowed at the time, because who was going to believe them? One of them was a 31-year-old cellist from Atlanta named Derek Johnson, who had been told by Whitaker in 2015 that his playing was technically acceptable but culturally unpolished. Derek posted his audition tape to the internet on Sunday. 2 million people watched it. The playing was exquisite. Whitaker refused to apologize. His statement, issued through his remaining publicist, read, "Exceptional circumstances do not erase the need for standards. I will be fully vindicated by the final." Margaret Anderson went on the local CBS affiliate that same night. She sat in the anchor's chair in a blue suit and told the interviewer on live television, "Harrison Whitaker is a fraud. He has been a fraud for 15 years. What you are watching this week is not a scandal. It is a reckoning, and it is overdue." The phones at the competition's corporate office did not stop ringing for 48 hours. 4 of the competition's platinum-tier sponsors announced they were reviewing their partnership. 2 of them pulled out entirely by Monday morning. Jonathan Taylor, the CEO, sat in his corner office and did the math, and understood that the competition could not survive another week of this. But he also understood that canceling the final now would be read by the public as a cover-up. So he did the cowardly thing. He placed Whitaker on administrative review, which was a phrase that meant nothing, and he announced that the final would proceed as scheduled, with Whitaker still seated as head judge. Margaret Anderson called him a coward to his face. On the record, Gregory Moore printed it Tuesday morning. Meanwhile, somewhere on the internet, an anonymous donor had started a GoFundMe page under the title, "For Denise Fletcher's Treatment." It had been started quietly on Friday, with a modest goal of $5,000. By Sunday night, it had raised $340,000. Brandon did not know about it. Denise did not know about it. Rebecca Williams had started it. Rebecca had not told anyone. On Friday night, Brandon sat at the church Steinway after hours, alone, with the sanctuary lights off except for the little lamp over the music stand. Eleanor had let him in with her own key and then gone home to let him have the room to himself. Denise was there, in the wheelchair Eleanor had borrowed from the church medical closet. Her oxygen tank hissed softly beside her. Brandon played Mama's Lullaby in D minor from beginning to end. The whole thing. His mother's completed version, with his own voice added to it over the last 7 years of working on it at night on the Casio keyboard when he was supposed to be asleep. It took him 4 minutes and 12 seconds to play it. Eleanor Brown, who had come back to lock up and was standing at the back of the sanctuary in the dark, pressed record on her phone. "For the archive," she said quietly when he finished. "In case." She did not say in case of what. Brandon turned on the bench and looked at his mother. Her eyes were closed. She was smiling. "Mama," he said, "if I win, the prize money goes to your treatment. If I lose, the truth still wins. Either way, he don't get to erase us." Denise opened her eyes. "Baby," she said. "He never could." 10. Showdown. 828 over 825. The final was broadcast live on Sunday night from the Lucas Theater. 11 million people tuned in. It was the largest audience the competition had ever drawn by a factor of 5. 3 finalists walked the red carpet into the theater. Colton Davis, in a custom tuxedo, flanked by his father and 2 publicists. A 17-year-old classical prodigy named Sophia Taylor, a genuinely gifted pianist from Charleston who had nothing to do with any of this. And Brandon Fletcher, in the same black thrift store suit he had worn to the audition, walking beside his mother's wheelchair. Eleanor Brown pushed the chair. Rebecca Williams walked 2 steps behind them. The crowd outside the theater parted for Denise Fletcher the way a crowd parts for a queen. Colton Davis performed first, a clean, aggressive Liszt etude, technically spotless, emotionally airtight, the way a sealed jar is airtight. Whitaker gave him a 9.9. Margaret Anderson gave him a 7.1, and did not look up from her scorecard when she read it aloud. Sophia Taylor performed second. A beautiful, heartfelt Rachmaninoff concerto excerpt. She deserved every bit of the 9.4 she received. She walked off the stage with the grace of a girl who knew she had not won and was at peace with it. Then they called Brandon. He walked out onto the stage of the Lucas Theater, and 1,600 people in the live audience went silent. He was 16 years old, in a suit that was still an inch too short in the sleeves. He carried no sheet music. He walked to the microphone beside the piano bench and waited for the room to settle. "For my final piece," he said, "I'll be performing an original composition. It's called Mama's Lullaby in D minor. I wrote it with someone who never got to finish it with me. My mother finished it instead. She's here tonight." The camera cut to Denise in the front row. She was wearing a dress Eleanor had found at a consignment shop. Pale blue, the color of a clear winter sky. Her oxygen tank sat beside her wheelchair. She was radiant. The camera cut to Whitaker. He had the professional mask on. Curious, unaware. The mask of a man who had not yet put the pieces together, because he had not yet allowed himself to. Brandon sat down at the piano. He played the first 30 seconds straight. The lullaby, simple, the way Harrison Whitaker had written the first 4 bars of it one August night in 2007 in a Savannah apartment he had not thought about in years. At the judges' table, Harrison Whitaker's pen stopped moving. His head tilted a quarter of an inch to the right. He recognized the melody. He recognized his own handwriting being played back to him. Brandon moved into the second movement, his mother's contribution. The years of grief folded into grace, the long, slow thing of raising a child by yourself in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Whitaker's jaw tightened. His hands had gone flat on the table. Brandon moved into the third movement, his own voice. The diner at 4 a.m. The cancer diagnosis read aloud by a doctor who did not make eye contact. The taped-together Casio keyboard. The refusal, night after night after night, to break. Whitaker's breathing had gone shallow, and then Brandon did the thing nobody in that theater, not even Margaret Anderson, saw coming. He braided all 3 voices together into a final movement. Father, mother, son. 3 melodic lines moving in counterpoint, each one answering the others, resolving at last into a single held chord that Harrison Whitaker himself could never have written. Because you cannot compose a forgiveness you have never earned, and you cannot resolve a song you walked away from before you heard how it ended. He held the chord. He released it. The Lucas Theater went silent for 9 full seconds. And then Denise Fletcher did something nobody had told her to do. She planted both of her thin hands on the arms of her wheelchair and pushed herself, slowly, painfully, to her feet. Eleanor Brown reached for her. Denise gently waved her off. She stood up in her pale blue dress in the front row of the Lucas Theater with an oxygen tube in her nose, and she began to sing, a cappella, the melody of the lullaby. Her mezzo-soprano was cracked and thin from 16 months of chemotherapy, and it was the most beautiful sound any of the 11 million people watching would hear that year. She sang it directly at Harrison Whitaker. At 3 minutes and 42 seconds into the broadcast clip of that moment, Harrison Whitaker's professional mask came off. All of it, at once. On live television in front of 11 million people, his mouth fell open and his eyes filled, and he mouthed a single, silent word at the thin woman singing in the front row. D. Margaret Anderson stood up. Then the audience. Then, on camera, Colton Davis, the rival, the donor's son, the boy who had been raised to win this exact competition, stood up from his seat in the wings and began to applaud. Rebecca Williams stepped out of the shadows at the back of the house carrying the manila envelope. The scores came up on the screen above the stage. Margaret Anderson, 10.0. Third judge, the conservatory dean who owed Harrison Whitaker favors, the man who had given Brandon a 6.4 in the semifinals. 10.0. He had watched Denise Fletcher stand up from that wheelchair, and he had made his choice in front of 11 million witnesses. Harrison Whitaker. He wrote the number with a hand that was visibly shaking. He pushed the card forward without looking up. 10.0. The Lucas Theater erupted. Jonathan Taylor walked out onto the stage in a dark suit and announced, into a trembling microphone, that the winner of the Southern Stars National Music Competition was Brandon Fletcher of Savannah, Georgia. $100,000, full scholarship to the Juilliard School. The audience was on its feet. The cameras were still rolling. Brandon walked to the center of the stage. He did not cry. He did not raise his fists. He walked to the front of the stage, and he looked down into the front row at his mother, and he mouthed 2 words. For you. Then he stepped off the stage and walked to the front row and knelt beside her wheelchair, and Denise Fletcher put her thin hands on her son's face and held him the way she had held him the day he was born. The cameras followed them. The live feed had not cut. Jonathan Taylor had been begged in his earpiece to cut the broadcast by every lawyer the corporate parent employed. Jonathan Taylor had refused. He had done one brave thing in his career, and he did it that night. And he did it because Margaret Anderson was standing next to him and had told him quietly that if he cut the feed, she would walk out onto the stage herself and tell the country exactly what was happening. Harrison Whitaker came down off the judge's platform. He walked across the front of the theater toward the Fletchers. The cameras tracked him. 11 million people watched him walk. He was a tall man in a navy suit, and he walked like a man who had forgotten how. He stopped 3 feet from the wheelchair. "Denise," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Is he?" "Yes." "Dee, I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Denise's voice was very steady. She did not raise it. She did not need to. "You don't get to claim him, Harrison. He built himself. You just happened to be one of the parts he had to build around." Rebecca Williams stepped forward then. In front of the cameras, in front of 11 million people, she opened the manila envelope she had carried for 14 weeks. She pulled out a DNA report and a paternity waiver dated 2007, and a signed affidavit from the lawyer who had drawn up the waiver. She handed them to Harrison Whitaker. "I'm your sister, Harrison," she said quietly. "Half-sister. Daddy's second marriage. I have known what you did since I was 18. I have been waiting 10 years for this boy to walk through a door I was standing behind." Harrison Whitaker took the envelope. He did not look at Rebecca. He did not look at the cameras. He looked at his son. Brandon looked back at him. Brandon did not speak. There was nothing Brandon needed to say. Harrison Whitaker turned and walked out of the Lucas Theater and into a parking lot full of reporters, and his career, which had been built on a lie he had spent 16 years maintaining, ended in the time it took him to reach his car. Within 72 hours, Whitaker was removed from the competition permanently. Jonathan Taylor resigned. The Southern Stars competition restructured with a blind audition first round and a permanent board seat from Margaret Anderson. All 6 of the previous contestants who had come forward received formal apologies and re-reviews of their submissions. Derek Johnson, the cellist from Atlanta, was invited to perform at the following year's gala. Brandon's prize money, combined with the GoFundMe that had by then crossed $400,000, covered Denise's experimental treatment in full. She entered the clinical trial in August. Eleanor Brown's tiny church on Cuyler Street received an anonymous donation 6 weeks later, enough to restore the sanctuary Steinway and to establish a music scholarship in Brandon's name. The donation came from Margaret Anderson. She never spoke of it publicly. 3 months into treatment, Denise's scans showed tumor reduction. She began, quietly, humming again around the apartment, the same melody, a little stronger each week. Brandon began at the Juilliard School that fall. On his dorm desk, he kept the cedar box his mother had carried for 16 years. It was empty now, except for a single photograph of him and his mother in the front row of the Lucas Theater the night of the final, taken just after she had stood up to sing. 6 months after the final, Brandon Fletcher recorded a video at Juilliard's Paul Hall. He sat alone at a Steinway in the empty recital hall, and he played Mama's Lullaby in D minor from beginning to end, the complete version, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He uploaded the file to a private link. He emailed that link to one person. No caption, no subject line, no demand, no invitation. Harrison Whitaker. People who still speak to Harrison say he listens to that recording once a week, alone, in the dark. They say he has not composed a note of music since the night of the final. They say he has tried. That is not forgiveness. Brandon did not send him forgiveness. Brandon sent him a door, left very slightly open, which is more than Harrison Whitaker had earned, and less than he will ever be able to walk through. Denise Fletcher is still alive. The experimental treatment has held her tumors stable for 14 months as of this recording. She sings at Mount Carmel Baptist on the first Sunday of every month. Her voice is stronger now than it was the night she stood up from that wheelchair. Brandon is a sophomore at Juilliard. He still wears second-hand suits. He still calls his mother every night at 9 p.m., the way he has since he was 11 years old. The Southern Stars competition, under its new leadership, has crowned 2 more grand prize winners since Brandon. Both of them have been black. Neither of them was asked at the door if they were lost. So I'll ask you this. If it were you, if the man who walked out on your mother was sitting on that judging panel, in a suit that cost more than your rent, smirking at your shoes, would you have played your song? Or would you have walked out of that theater and never looked back? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And here is one thing most people miss. At 3 minutes and 42 seconds into the final broadcast, watch Harrison Whitaker's lips. He mouths one word. Just one. That single silent word is the whole story. Go back. Watch his mouth. If this one hits you somewhere real, drop a like, share it with somebody who needs to hear that talent outlasts prejudice, and subscribe. Because next week, a black nurse gets fired for talking back to the hospital board. Turns out, she was the only one in the room with the receipts. You are not going to want to miss it.